Thank you, Joan. Today we will be continuing in our series on discipleship with the Master. And we're going to do that by looking at one of the most famous lessons Jesus ever taught to his disciples. So if you would, grab your Bibles and turn with me to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verse 22. If you don't have a Bible, I urge you to get one out of the chair in front of you. Matthew, the first book of the New Testament. Matthew, starting in verse 22 of chapter 14. You follow along in your copy as I read verse 22. Immediately he, that is Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by waves, for the wind was against them. Verse 22 begins with a very interesting word. It's the word immediately. Anytime you see a word like immediately show up in the text, you have to immediately look at the verses that came before the word immediately to see what was going on immediately before. And in this case, the event that immediately came before the immediately is the feeding of the 5,000. So please understand, the disciples have just filled up 12 baskets with the leftovers from a meal that Jesus made with just 5 loaves and 2 small fishes. 12 baskets full. And now immediately after the baskets are filled with the leftovers, after feeding 5,000 men plus women and children, Jesus orders the disciples to get into their boat and to head to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, I want you to look at the language that Matthew uses here in verse 22. According to verse 22, Jesus he compelled the disciples to get into the boat and to shove off for the opposite shore. Apparently, the disciples must have been somewhat reluctant to leave without Jesus. Remember, many of them are fishermen. They know the weather, and they can see that there's some kind of a front coming in. They don't want to go, but Jesus made them go. Next, if you look at verse 23, Jesus now sends the crowd away. Having sent the disciples away, he sends the crowd away. But how does he do it? Well, I want to use John's gospel and Mark's gospel this morning to supplement what we're doing in Matthew. So go to John chapter 6. John chapter 6 will give us more insight into what's happening here. I want to look at verses 14 and 15. By the way, in Mark's gospel and in John, the parallel account is going to be in chapter 6. Either way, chapter 6. But here in John chapter 6, verse 14, we read that when the people saw the sign, that is the feeding of the 5,000, when they saw the sign that Jesus had done, they said, "Hey, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take Jesus by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again from the mountain by himself. So, get the picture in your mind. Having been wowed by the feeding of the 5,000, the crowd is thinking, what a deal. We need to grab Jesus and make him king. Free lunches forever. It'll be great. But knowing what they're planning, notice what Jesus does. He leaves the people and he goes up onto a mountain. We don't know if he did it in a sneaky way or while they weren't looking, he just went away. But his way of dismissing the crowd was just to leave the crowd and go up in the mountain by himself. So come back to Matthew 14. And look at verse 23. According to verse 23, Jesus stayed on the mountain and he prayed. But notice the details that Matthew, again, is providing for us. First of all, Matthew tells us the time when Jesus finished praying. It was evening. At the risk of sounding like one of the hobbits from The Lord of the Rings, any Lord of the Rings fans here? You remember how The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits have first breakfast and second breakfast? Well, here we are dealing with second evening. Second evening. Second evening equates with that time between 6 and 9 p.m. And if you scan back up in the context to verse 15, here in chapter 14, you can see that the arrival of first evening, which by the way is 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, is what precipitated the feeding of the 5,000. So now it's second evening, somewhere between 6 and 9 in the evening. Next, back in verse 23, don't miss the fact that Matthew is repeating himself. He tells us that Jesus went up on the mountain by himself. And then at the end of the verse it says, and Jesus was alone. Why the repetition of that fact that Jesus is alone? Well, I think obviously Jesus wants to be alone, and Matthew wants to make that clear. For Jesus, he wants to pray in solitude, and that's important. It is of prime importance for him to spend this time alone with his Father. Now, we're not told just how long Jesus spent in prayer, but check out verse 24. But the boat, by this time, was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. By the time Jesus finishes praying, the disciples were already in big trouble. Matthew says that the boat was a long way from the shore. In John's Gospel, he says that it was 3 to 4 miles out. We know that the Sea of Galilee is something like 8 by 5 miles. So doing the math quickly, you can see that the disciples have made it to the middle, and that's about as far as they've gotten. Notice also that this rain or this storm is not a rainstorm as we sometimes picture it. I think artists sometimes have done us a disservice. It's not a rainstorm so much as it's a windstorm. How fitting that this is a sermon today, as we've been experiencing a windstorm. And the wind, notice, is raising huge waves on the sea. In fact, the boat is being beaten and battered by the waves. In Mark's account, he tells us that the wind is not only contrary, but the disciples are having to row. And the word that he uses there to describe the rowing is that they are straining at the oars. That Greek word straining talks about pain. It talks about torment. In some places in classical Greek, it's used of torture. The disciples are in very desperate straits. The last time they had been caught in such a mess at sea, you remember that Jesus had been with them. That was recorded for us in Matthew chapter 8. But this time Jesus is not with them. This time Jesus is miles away up on a mountain praying. This time the disciples are on their own and they're fighting for their very lives. Now imagine the disciples thinking. Indeed, put yourself in the boat with them. They've just been with Jesus on the mountainside for the feeding of the 5,000. They've just watched Jesus perform one of the most amazing miracles in the Gospels. The people were intending to make Jesus king, which, if you think about it, would have made the disciples very important people. I can just think that as they set off across the sea in their boat, they were thinking, yeah, when Jesus becomes king, I can see I'm going to have an ambassador to Egypt. Yeah, that would fit. I mean, they're thinking about the power, the position that they're going to have. Just a few hours ago, things were looking very good, and now they're about to die, or no one will ever find them. They'll be at the bottom of the sea. So take a peek at verse 25. And in the 4th watch of the night, he, that is Jesus, came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. And they said, "Ah! It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." We talked a little bit about what evening meant. Let's talk a little bit about the 4th watch. The 4th watch is that time just before dawn. You know how the old expression is, it's darkest before the dawn? Well, that's kind of where the disciples are. That means that the disciples, though, if we do the math, have been rowing against the wind, fighting the wind for more than 6 hours, maybe as much as 9 hours. Can you imagine straining at the oars for 6+ hours while all the time the wind and the waves are throwing the boat up and down? Visualize what's taking place here. This is no still small thing. Jesus, sometimes we picture him again as walking on a glassy surface, knowing where the stones are just under the surface to walk on the water. This is not the case here. These disciples have been straining at the oars. The oars and the ship are just up in the air, maybe cresting on the top of a wave, and then all of a sudden they're being thrown down into the trough of the wave, where all the way around them there's just water. The boat is not just going up and down, it's going left and right, it's moving like this and like that. As I tell you about it, I'm getting seasick. Can you imagine what they're going through? This is very scary stuff. And Jesus had waited a very long time, therefore, before he came. And he did this intentionally. Please understand, Jesus knew what would happen out at sea. He knew what was going on. In fact, I believe he knew what would happen before he made them get into the boat to cross to the other side. Also understand, Jesus could have stilled this storm from where he was on the mountaintop. A few weeks back, we studied the story of the centurion slave, where Jesus healed that slave from a distance without ever having to touch or talk or even see that slave. Jesus could have done that here. He could have stopped the storm. He could have stopped the waves, but he didn't. He didn't need to walk 3 to 4 miles to get to the boat. He could have just saved his disciples long before this. But obviously, Jesus had a purpose for what was happening. His purpose was that he wanted to demonstrate his glory. He wanted to teach his disciples to see his glory. Now, I need you to do a little thinking with me. A little bit of thinking and a little bit of imagination. Again, put yourself in the boat. You're there straining at those oars for 6 to 9 hours. I was talking to somebody this morning after first service about that. The disciples are going, ow, blisters. Especially when their fingers are all wrinkly from being wet. Ugh. They've been working this whole time trying to save their lives. And even though it's a dark and stormy night, notice this. Jesus comes directly to the boat. He's not having to search where they are in that billowing mess. And how does he come? He comes walking on the sea. He's walking on the waves. Again, picture what's going on here. He's climbing up over each wave and coming down the other side. It's like going up and over sand dunes, except the sand dunes are moving. And Jesus comes this way, walking to them. Since the boat is being battered about by the waves, the surface of the wave must have been filled with large, rolling undulations of waves. The guys are rowing for all they're worth. But suddenly they catch sight of something. They see, probably not far from the boat, someone... It looks like somebody's walking on the waves. It's as if the storm is not scary enough. They suddenly see something that drives them to terror. Look again the way Matthew puts that in his gospel. They were terrified. By the way, through whatever light they could see through the clouds or maybe through lightning, we don't know. They see what appears to be a man walking on the water, but they know that can't be. These are fishermen. They know this stuff. Men don't walk on water, let alone on storm-tossed waves. Therefore, this figure must be something else. This figure must be some kind of a spirit. The Greek word that's used here for ghost is phantasma, from where we get our word phantasm. And they're terrified. If the storm was not scaring them to death, now they are scared to death. Now, isn't it interesting that the very thing that makes them terrified more than the wind and the waves is the one who's coming to save them? How often are we just like that? How often are we just like the disciples? In the midst of the storm, we get even more frightened and fearful when Christ brings solution into our lives. Well, lest I preach on that, come back to Matthew 14 and look at verse 27. They see a phantasm, and they cry out, it's a ghost. They're terrified, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. There's that word immediately once again. Just as soon as the guys cry out in their fear that there's a phantasm, Jesus speaks. He speaks to them. Over the roaring of the wind, stronger than the sound of the waves battering the boat, the disciples hear not the moaning, creeping voice of a ghost, but the comforting, reassuring voice of their master. And Jesus commands them to have courage. He tells them, stop fearing. Now, are you picturing all this in your minds? The boat is being tossed, battered, back and forth, rotating up, down, all around. The wind and the waves are everywhere, and standing on the surging sea is Jesus. No wonder the disciples are terrified. So look at verse 28. Jesus says to them, remember, don't be afraid. So Peter replies, you knew it would be Peter, right? Peter replies and he answers him, Lord, if it is you, notice the conditional thing here. Peter's still not so sure. If it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, I can't speak for you, but seriously? I mean, come on. If I had just gone through what Peter had been going through for the last 6 to 9 hours, I would have wanted to stay in the boat. But not Peter. Peter wants to get out and walk over to Jesus. Now, you look at that and you go, well, okay, it's Peter. I get that. But maybe, let's give him a little credit here, maybe Peter thought it was safer to be on the waves with Jesus than to be in the boat without him. But why does Peter want Jesus to command him to come? Well, I think Peter knows that if Jesus has the power to walk on the waves, then Jesus has the power to give Peter that authority if Jesus will indeed command him to come. And credit him, again, do not put Peter down. He does not presume to try this wave walking thing unless Jesus gives him the right to do it. So look again at Matthew's Gospel and look at verse 29. Jesus replies to Peter with one word. He says, come. Come. And so Peter gets out of the boat, walked on the water, and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me! And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Now again, give Peter credit for trying this. I mean, he gets out of the boat and steps out onto the rolling waves. Remember, the wind is blowing. The waves are still there. The boat is still jacking around in all kinds of directions. And Peter is stepping off of that gyrating boat, stepping into something that is also gyrating and moving all around. Look, I have a problem getting onto and off of escalators. I can't imagine what this must have been like. But Peter does it. He manages somehow to keep his feet and to actually walk towards Jesus on the waves. But then Peter focuses more on the waves than on his Lord. He took his eyes off of Jesus and he looks at the huge billowing waves that are being driven by the wind, and he gets scared, and as he gets scared, he begins to sink. His faith was enough to get him out of the boat, but not enough to keep him focused on Jesus once he is outside the boat. And as he's beginning to go under, he cries out to Jesus and he says, Lord, save me! And Jesus must have been very close to him at the time, because he simply reaches out his hand, takes a hold of Peter. And as Jesus stabilizes his adventurous disciple, Jesus does something interesting. He calls Peter a name. Yeah, right there. He calls Peter a name. Jesus starts name calling. He calls Peter an oligopiste. You oligopiste, which in our language translates as, you little faith. Remember, Peter's nickname was Little Rock, so I guess little faith might fit. Apparently, Peter's faith got little when he saw the waves get big. But make no mistake, Peter still has faith. Peter has faith. He has faith to get out of the boat. He has faith enough to trust in Jesus, to give him the power to walk on the water. And in verse 31, Jesus asks Peter a question. Not only does he call him a name, he asks him a question. He says, why did you doubt? Well, Peter sometimes we think of as replying too quickly, but this time apparently he says nothing in answer to the question. He doesn't reply, and he and Jesus simply climb back into the boat. And notice what happens in verse 32. And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. As soon as Jesus gets into the boat, the wind stops. And with it, I assume, the waves. Suddenly, without any warning, the wind and the waves become quiet. Just like that. It's hard to imagine the sudden stillness where just a second before the whole sea had been billowing in all kinds of directions with the wind and the waves. But the stillness, my friends, is not the only miraculous thing that happened. Keep your finger once more here in Matthew, but go to John 6, to the parallel there. Because in John's gospel, John's going to tell us something else that's even more astounding than the stilling of the waves and the wind. John 6:21 is where I want you to head. John writes this, then they were glad to take Jesus into the boat, to which I go, duh! I would have been thrilled to have back Jesus in the boat. But then they were glad to take Jesus into the boat, and now John starts with the immediatelys, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. What? 3 to 4 miles out at sea, and immediately the waves stop, the wind stops, and bam, they're on the beach. 3 to 4 miles out, and now they're on the beach. So come back to Matthew, and look at how the disciples respond to this. Look at verse 33. And those in the boat, that is the 12 disciples, those in the boat worshiped Jesus. They worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. The reaction of the disciples is to worship Jesus. They worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. What an event. What an incredible story in the life and times of Jesus. You got to admit, this episode in the series that we're doing on discipleship with the Master has more action in it than all the others put together. But I want to go back to the story where it starts. So back up in your mind a little bit, and let me ask you a very important question. It's a why question. Why? Why did Jesus put his disciples through this? I mean, Jesus knew that the storm was coming, and yet he made them. He compelled them. He ordered the disciples to get into the boat without him. Why? Well, the best answer I can come up with is this. Apparently there are things that you just can't learn eating bread and eating fish on a sunny, grassy hillside that you can only learn in the midst of a storm-tossed sea. Before Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and sail to the other side of the sea, they had just witnessed one of the most spectacular, amazing miracles of all time. Jesus had fed 5,000 men, plus women, plus children, with 5 small loaves and 2 fish. Amazing. Miraculous. Out of this world. But look at Mark's version in Mark chapter 6. Look at verse 51. Here Mark, perhaps writing down what Peter was thinking, because traditionally we think of Mark's gospel as really Peter's gospel. Peter reflecting all these things to Mark. We get Peter's remembrance perhaps from the story. And it tells us something very significant. Mark 6:51. Mark says that Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. Okay, we've covered that. And now look what he adds. Mark says, and they were utterly astounded. They're shocked. Why? Answer, verse 52. Because they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. They didn't get it with the loaves because their hearts were hardened. Think about this. The disciples had witnessed the feeding of the 5,000, and yet they still did not comprehend the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. The word translated hard here is the word for turned to stone. It's petrified. So what had happened was that the disciples actually recognized something about Jesus in the feeding of the 5,000. They've been recognizing things about Jesus all the way along through the Gospels. But what were they recognizing? Well, apparently, it might have been something that the crowd was thinking. Remember, John tells us that the crowd thought that it was probably something that the disciples were thinking too. The crowd thought, they saw Jesus feed the 5,000 and they thought he was the prophet. Notice the definite article, the, not just a prophet, the prophet. They thought he was the Messiah. And he is. They thought he was the Messiah. He's amazing. He's more than just a prophet. But they didn't take it far enough. And it doesn't take a lot of thought to see that the disciples in the crowd were thinking alike. They recognized Jesus as special, more impressive, more authority, more power than the prophets of old. He is the prophet, the Messiah. But because of Jesus' arrival in the boat, now they're not thinking that anymore. Now they know something. They know that Jesus is more than a prophet, more than the prophet. They know that Jesus is God. Jesus is the Son of God, and they do what is appropriate with the Son of God. They worshiped him. So come back to Matthew 14. Look at verse 33. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. While before they probably believed that Jesus was the prophet, now they can say with certainty, truly, absolutely, obviously, you are the Son of God. Before they were wowed by him as a miracle worker, but now they worship him as the creator. Before they were in awe of him as a teacher, now they adore him as the Son of God. Before they respected him as a prophet, now they revere him as the God who sends the prophets. Listen, Jesus didn't walk on water to teach his disciples how to do that. He walked on water to teach them who he was, who he is. because Jesus is God. But there's more. There's more I want to share with you. Jesus was not only teaching them that he was God, he was teaching them that as the Son of God, he will act on their behalf no matter where they are, no matter what the problem might be, no matter how impossible the situation might have gotten. Jesus will act. Thus, they can know that they can go through the storms and the wind and the waves because they belong to the one who controls the waves. They can know that they can go through the storms of life because they belong to the one who commands the storms. Indeed, not only can they survive the storms of life, they can actually learn from the storms of life because they serve the Son of God who commands and controls the storms. He's the creator. He's God. Brothers and sisters, we need to face this. We can get to know Jesus in the good times. But it's in the dangerous times of storm-tossed waves of cancer and the horrible storms of heart disease and the loss of a loved one that can teach us not only to know Jesus, but to begin to trust him as God, because that's who he is. So, this morning, let me ask you once again, as we have throughout this series, who do you see Jesus as being? Who is Jesus in your perspective? Do you see him simply as some kind of miracle worker, as a source of sustenance where you can plug in your quarter's worth of prayer request and out comes bread and fish or whatever you think you need? Or do you really, truly, absolutely, obviously, honestly know that Jesus is the Son of God? Listen, if you have doubts as to the real power of Jesus, the real authority of Jesus, then maybe you need to quit avoiding going through the storms and maybe instead try to recognize the glory of Christ in the storm. You see, there are things you cannot learn on a sunny, grassy hillside eating bread and fish. The fact is, some things can only be learned on the storm-tossed, billowing waves. Let's acknowledge it. On the sunny hillsides, it's possible, indeed very probable, that you can get to know Jesus as a great teacher. You can get to know him as a wise leader. You can get to know him as a kind and generous friend. But there's nothing like being rescued from the billowing waves of a storm-tossed sea to teach you to trust in Jesus as God. Nothing is better to build your trust in him as God than seeing him rescue you when you've exhausted all your possibilities that you have on your own. This morning I want to give you one more passage. It's the passage that Derek read for us earlier. I want you to turn to Psalm 116 once again. Psalm 116, starting at verse 1. Look what the psalmist says here. I love this psalm. Psalm 116, verse 1. The psalmist said, I love the Lord. Why? Because he has heard my voice and my pleas for mercy. Because he has inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call on him as long as I live. The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of Sheol laid hold of me. I suffered distress and anguish. But then verse 4, then I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, I pray, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return, O my soul, to your rest, for the Lord has dealt bountifully with you. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Let me repeat those last two verses once more. For you have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. Therefore I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. My friends, it's a fact. There are things that can't be learned on the grassy hillside that can only be learned when God rescues you from the storm-tossed sea. There are things to be learned in the waves of the storm that you just can't learn on a grassy hillside. Jesus is the one who we can trust. He is the Son of God. Pray with me to him. Holy Lord and Savior Jesus, thank you. Thank you for this passage that reveals to us who you are, that revealed to the disciples who you are. Lord, do not let us take you lightly. You are the Son of God. You are, yes, the Messiah. Yes, you are the prophet. Yes, you are the miracle worker. Yes, you are the great teacher. But you are much, 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 much more. You are God, the creator, sustainer, sovereign God. Lord, forgive us for where we have failed to trust you, where we have taken you for granted. You are God who came into this world, who took on flesh so that you could die for your people, so that you could redeem them, so that you could not only pay the price and give them forgiveness, but so that you could live a life of obedience and then give us your righteousness. Oh, Lord, do not let us take any of that lightly, but help those facts then to compel us to live for you, to live trusting in you, never taking you for granted, but knowing that we can trust you no matter what. You are God. Lord, let us to live our lives in worship. Worship. And we know, Lord, that you have told us in your word that the way to love you is to obey you. The way to demonstrate our love for you is to obey you. So help us, Lord, to obey you as the very Son of God.